Hi, everybody. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Mario Alarreta. I work in people development and part of the team that manages programs like GPOS and Search Inside Yourself. And it's my great pleasure to introduce this morning to all of us, to all of you, Frederick Marx. Nominated for both an Academy Award and Emmy Award, Frederick Marx is a producer, a director, writer, and editor with 40 years in the film and the TV business. His last film, Journeyed from Zanskar, featuring the Dalai Lama and Richard Gere, is in worldwide distribution. Most known for Hoop Dreams, which was named the best documentary of all time by the International Documentary Association, Marx has screened his films at the world's most prestigious festivals, networks, and venues. Other recognitions include Chicago Tribune Artist of the Year, Guggenheim Fellow, and recipient of a Robert F. Kennedy Special Achievement Award. Frederick also has practiced mindfulness meditation for over 20 years, and is intimately familiar with different branches of Buddhist practice. The title of his talk today is Living Your Life's Purpose. And now, without further ado, please welcome to Google, Frederick Marx. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. And first, I just want to thank you, Mario, for going to the trouble to set this up and make it happen. And also Bill Duane, who's part of the same team, for inviting me here to speak to all of you today. It's a real privilege. You know, I get to fulfill my life's purpose by being here to talk to you. So, and I've had the privilege of coming to understand my own life in very simple terms. My life is about two things, art and service. That's it. So this presentation today is the latter part of that. It's about service. It's about me coming to share some of what I think is important about what I've learned about life with all of you. And more on that point in just a few minutes. So what I want to do now is just share with you this film that we just finished last March. And this is going to be a lot of what we talk about today.
A 14-year-old,
a 14-year-old, and an 18-year-old
relish the destruction.
Teen and preteen drug and alcohol abuse.
Teenage bullying is an epidemic.
a small group of young punks.
Self-inducing abortions.
Series of murders and shootings.
It was mayhem.
Boys putting their own lives at risk.
15-year-old.
A 15-year-old. This teenager
Stole a car.
Gangs of young people. Teens in crisis.
Punks. It seemed like a war zone.
When a culture doesn't provide formal rites of passage or initiations, then you get usually destructive versions of it.
Maybe if we had other ways for kids to illustrate their adult-like qualities, that they wouldn't resort to these antisocial ones.
That's what gang activity is about. That's what vandalism and all of that kind of destruction is about how do I prove to the world that I'm here and that I'm a man, that I'm not a little kid anymore?
Young people at a certain age, it's very natural and important that they begin to challenge the values of their upbringing and of their culture, and to begin to look and go inward.
as communities do we respond to this need? Our social infrastructure has broken down. Half of our marriages fall apart. Everybody's working so hard that community is in fragments. How do we come together to provide this for young people?
Without a mentor as a companion, it won't work.
I love you.
Initiation depends on the generosity of the grown-ups, and the mentor has to be someone that's not going to abandon that boy.
When communities saw that this was happening in young people and they were beginning to rebel against the cultural values or the parent values, they knew, okay, this is good, something right is happening. They're ready, and it's time for them to be initiated. And so for the health of the community and the health of the individual, they created rites of passage ceremonies.
The question then is, do we actually consecrate those markers? Do we celebrate those markers? Do we prepare our young people so that as they're moving from one stage to the next, that they understand that for every privilege, there is a corresponding responsibility? In absence of that, the day a child gets a driver's license is the day they steal their mom's car. The day they are old enough to buy alcohol is the day they get drunk. And on and on and on.
We are not addressing the needs of young people, and we have taken away, I think, from many of them opportunities to participate meaningfully in the community. It deprives them of this chance to understand themselves better and to develop a sense of being important.
I don't see it as a failure of the young. I see it as a failure of the elders. So we as elders, we have responsibility. We have no choice but to speak, to teach, to show, and hope and bring the young along with us.
The human psyche so desperately needs ceremonial markings. It is like magic.
We'll find that the community will be safer. We'll find that kids will be less violent, less confused, less suicidal. These are better than meds, better than going to the prisons and juvenile facilities.
Every family unit, every community, every bigger clan, every village, city, town, state, whatever, need to figure out for their young people what works. How do you initiate?
Mother, father, guardians, I take my leave of you. I go away now to see a vision of my future. When I return, I will no longer be your child.
Start to think about what your mission is, what you want to do.
initiation and mentorship that's helped me by realizing that it's okay to cry in front of like men, but in front of women, without feeling like you're any less of a man.
After my initiation with women, every time I feel myself, like my foundation wavering, instead of needing to run to my husband or to these usual go-to people that are holding so much, it's my sisters, it's the women that can really hold me.
We also have to ask, what's the community losing by not engaging young people?
The Creator put this person on the planet. We're supposed to nurture them to the point that we become recipients of the gift that they have. That's what Rites of Passage told me. Assist that person's growth so that when their gift is revealed to the world will benefit. That's an adult's responsibility.
Call you.
Well, thank you for that. Any questions? Well, that is a kind of an overview of everything that I want to talk about with you today. So we're going to just kind of circle back and zero in on a number of different subjects that I raised in the short film there. And I want to start by getting a sense of you folks. And so I want to ask you some questions, and I just ask you to just raise your hand if you've ever asked yourself any of these questions, or in fact might still be wrestling with them. What is the purpose of my life? What am I here on this planet to do? Yeah, my hand has been up for all of these questions, and in fact, it still is up for some of them. And I'm going to be 60 in a few weeks. So where do I fit in? You know, what's my place in the world, in the cosmos? What, if anything, is uniquely mine to offer? What are my gifts? You know, the Native Americans use the term medicine. Their belief is that every human being represents a unique medicine that they are here in this lifetime to offer their community, their family, all of those around them. So what is your medicine? And how will I face my life's coming challenges? How will I get to be that man or woman that I've always wanted to be? When will I be accepted and honored as an equal among elders, among other adults in this society? And who or what is going to help me across that threshold of adolescence or young adulthood into older adulthood or more maturity? And in fact, am I still on that journey? So even though you all didn't raise your hands for those, my guess is that those questions hit reasonably deep. So the question that I ask myself is where can young people get answers to these questions? Who is out there to support them in uncovering answers to these questions for themselves? And then the biggest question I've asked myself is, are rites of passage and mentorship the missing link in youth development? In a sense, what I would call the unifying field theory of youth development. Almost a silver bullet, perhaps. So, this is the bucket of challenges that's facing us. You saw some of that in the film. No one is really connecting the dots and considering that initiation and mentorship, which, by the way, I think of as two halves of one whole. Mentorship is required before, during, and after any kind of initiation or rite of passage process. That's just one set of problems. There's also another problem. If we don't initiate girls and boys when they're young, they grow up and they live out their lives in suspended adolescence. And yeah, Charlie Sheen is sort of the perfect poster boy for that. But in fact, take a look around. We have adults, quote unquote, living out their suspended adolescence in all kinds of institutions across this country, right? Government, I tend to think of as Animal House half the time. It's a fraternity gone crazy. Corporations, other institutions. So we're all paying a price for that, for the uninitiated serving in these capacities. It's interesting too. I was looking online and I was curious how old Google was. And as you may or may not know, Google just passed its 17th anniversary this month, September 4th. That makes Google a 17-year-old. So I'm asking myself, well, what is Google as an institution doing to cross this threshold of adolescence into young adulthood? And frankly, I take it as a very positive sign, the mindfulness program that that's his last name, right? Ming started here, and that Bill Duane and Mario and others are implementing across Google land around the world. To me, that's emblematic of stepping into maturity consciously. And I really am curious to see what other kinds of steps Google might be taking in the near future to do this consciously. So long about now, you're probably asking yourself, well, was I initiated into adulthood? And if so, what comprised that experience for me? So for me, that journey began when I was 9 years old. My dad died suddenly of a heart attack. And I said goodbye to him, goodnight to him one day, and he had a heart attack in the night, and I never saw him again. So not only did I not have any closure with him, but on the way to the funeral, my uncle, his younger brother, he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, well, Freddie, you're the man of the house now. And I was 9. So the problem in that, there's a lot of problems, but one of them is how exactly am I supposed to do that? And I wanted desperately as a 9-year-old to take care of my mother, to take care of my older sister and my younger brother. But I had no way of knowing how to do that and how to grow into that responsible man that I wanted to be in my lifetime. And so, and of course, saying it doesn't make it real, right? I needed initiation. I needed education about becoming the man that I wanted to become. So in my teen years, I got way into drugs and alcohol, and fortunately survived it without hurting myself or anybody else, which is a typical experience for a lot of teens. Unconsciously, in my view, seeking that experience of initiation, wanting to push themselves to the edge, but not having societal mechanisms to hold them and keep them safe. So I never got that mentorship. My uncle didn't stick around to show me how to become that man that I wanted to be. I never got it from any other men. They weren't there in my life. Fortunately, I did have, starting in my late 20s, a mindfulness practice. And it started with Buddhism, as I practiced Buddhism, and I did a chanting practice. And then it eventually led to long meditation retreats, a daily meditation practice. And now, it's really one of the fundamental pillars that holds up my life, along with so-called men's work and this rites of passage work. The two of them together are really what sustained me in my lifetime. So, you might be thinking for yourself, well, what is it that sustains me? And what was, or did I have a rite of passage? So for me, I finally had it as I was approaching my 40th birthday. It was almost exactly 20 years ago in Chicago that I took a weekend workshop with a group called the Mankind Project, a workshop called the New Warrior Training Adventure. 48 hours, you come at 5 p.m. on a Friday and leave at 5 p.m. on a Sunday. And I finally had that experience that I so unconsciously craved as a teen. And it taught me a number of really fundamental things. It taught me about accountability and integrity. As a young boy, I intuitively knew I wanted to be a man who could walk his talk, that when I said something, it was going to happen, and people could rest assured in that. But I didn't know how to sort of make that happen. And I also didn't know what to do in the case where I had to renegotiate some agreement. So that's something that I learned on that weekend, was about how to walk my talk, how to be a man of integrity, and how to exercise accountability in my ongoing daily life. Another thing it taught me was about emotions, about how not to fear my emotions or hide my emotions, but actually how to learn to recognize them and to integrate them effectively and meaningfully in my ongoing life. And for most of us, as men especially in this culture, obviously that is something we are not taught by the dominant culture, right? If we're given any outlet at all for our emotions, it's usually anger, and that's about it. So that was a revelation for me, huge, that I could actually access some of these things like fear, like grief, like anger, and use them as energizing tools to live the life that I wanted to live as a man. The other thing it taught me about was what we call shadows, which is a neo-Jungian term, Carl Jung, the Swiss philosopher and psychologist. Shadows are the dark side that's in all of us. Every human being has a dark side. All of that we hide, repress, and deny, that we do not want to admit is true for the beings that we are. So it took 50 strong men on this weekend workshop to basically hold up a mirror to me and say, take a look. This is you too. And you need to own these parts of yourself. And if you don't, you're going to be dangerous. Because what happens is, if we don't acknowledge and own the shadows that are in each of us, they'll leak out sideways. And before you know it, we'll be beating up on children or domestic partners, or abusing ourselves, again, through drug and alcohol abuse. Whatever it looks like, whatever form it takes, that's shadow-driven behavior. Comes from some fundamental misunderstanding of who we are as human beings. A lie, if you will, that we took on when we were young. I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. I don't deserve success. I don't deserve happiness. We all, in a sense, carry some of these lies. So the other thing, a number of other things that it taught me, but one of them was how to live in a community of men cooperatively rather than competitively. I had no idea that was possible. Being a child of this dominant culture, I thought, well, men are supposed to compete. They're supposed to compete for scarce resources, jobs, money, women, whatever. To experience men in that environment where I could actually see and touch, if you will, their open, vulnerable hearts and have them do the same with mine was huge. It also taught me a little bit about my mission or my life purpose. And everybody has one, in my belief. They just need to be supported in finding it. And that's something way bigger than your job or even your career. It's fundamentally what you're here on the planet to do, to accomplish with your lifetime. And lastly, it taught me how the meaning of life is to be found in service and not in consumption. And that's, of course, the dominant message, right? Despite what the bumper sticker says, whoever dies with the most toys wins, you know, we're actually here to serve and support each other. And the big undelivered information from the dominant culture is that that's actually where happiness lies. That we'll actually be happier as human beings if we can see the impact of our actions on those around us and how it's making their lives better. So that's where I first learned that lesson. So those are just some of the lessons that Rites of Passage teaches. Now, you just saw this definition in the movie, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I just want to go back over a couple of key parts of it. So, you know, the old maxim is true that it takes a whole village to raise a child. Parents can't do it alone. And doing so, reaching out as a parent to a neighbor or to a coach or to a teacher, you know, or a friend of the family, actually helps rebuild this torn and broken fabric of community and that we all suffer from in this modern world, broken and torn communities. So that's one key thing. The other is perceived to be transformative by youth. You know, it's not for us as adults to say, okay, you've arrived. You're a young adult now. You're a man now. You're a woman now. We need to have them evidence this. And they don't do it through language, by and large, although that's part of it. They say, wow, I can't believe what I've just experienced, but man, I am a different human being. That's great. But we need to see it in their eyes, alive, right? We need to see it in their body movements. You know, there's some excitement, there's some aliveness there, and some groundedness there too. So the other thing is offer increased status, right? They need to know that they've arrived. You know, they're equals now with us as adults. And voting, drinking, driving, you know, having sex, they're not enough. We need to ritually consecrate these moments in time and ideally come together as community to celebrate and acknowledge the learnings, the education that has preceded it, that has justified this moment where we can celebrate these young people for this passage. It's fundamental. So there's three main stages, really, of rites of passage. And this all comes from Arnold van Gennep, who wrote about this over 100 years ago. You know, separation or descent is really one. We have to separate young people from everything that is familiar to them. And yes, that includes computers and cell phones and TVs and all the rest of it. We have to separate them from the patterns that establish their daily life. Sleep, food, maybe even dress. And it's also called descent because it's dropping. It's dropping into what we are fundamentally as human beings. That all of that other stuff, the trappings of daily modern life, obfuscate, cloud, make difficult to see. So then the key part, the ordeal or threshold. It's also called liminality. You know, that word that means sort of twilight zone, between the worlds, okay? So there has to be some kind of ordeal where the young person is challenged physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally. They're brought down into the depths of their being, and they can experience at a fundamental level just how actually resilient they are, how strong they are. They won't know this until they're tested. And then the reintegration or homecoming, as it's called. So you have to come back from this experience. You have to be, again, ritually welcomed, celebrated by your community and family. And you have to be reintegrated. So that what's key here is the learning about who you are as a unique individual, the gifts that you have. The elders ideally will help you understand what those gifts are so that you can integrate them into the community and start to give them freely. Because a gift ungiven is a gift that almost doesn't exist. It has to be given to those around. So what does this look like, for an average teen? Well, adolescents have to confront two base fears, right? One is leaving mom and dad home. No one wants to do that. Why should you? You get 3 meals a day. Ideally, you have a roof over your head you're taken care of. You have to be, in a sense, forced away from that relationship. Some writers on this subject matter call it cutting that second umbilical cord. That second umbilical cord, the one that happens at the end of adolescence, that has to be cut. And it's not happening now in society. We'll return to that subject. So the other thing, there has to be at some level a facing of death. And the simple truth is, it's bad enough, challenging enough. And some of you, I'm sure, have experienced this, like I have, when somebody close to you in your family, somebody dear to you has died, right? That, in a sense, can be a beginning of a rite of passage. If you have the proper mentorship from an elder, they can help you understand what is the meaning of this moment in time in your lifetime. I didn't have that when I was 9 years old from my uncle or anybody else. But even more than that, we have to understand our own mortality. The fragility and yet the preciousness of this very sacred thing of our own human life. And until we're brought into proximity with death, until we at least fear that we're going to die, we're not going to experience that. It's not going to happen. We'll unconsciously fear it the rest of our lives, but we won't know in our hearts and souls what our capacity is to withstand challenges and to face death. So the ordeal, in a sense, what's called for here is the young person needs to metaphorically die to their childhood self to be reborn as an adult. And then the reintegration, one of the key lessons that's a part of rite of passage that needs to be brought back into community is every child and every adolescent tends to see the world in a me kind of way, right? And to be a fully mature adult, it requires us to see things as us. We need to do it together. Because without that cooperation, there is only domination. So there's lots of different forms of rites of passage that still exist around the world. These are just some of them. And it's interesting because, all of the damage that we've done to indigenous cultures around the world who have understood for thousands of years. The African proverb that you saw at the beginning of the film. If we do not initiate the young, they will burn down the village to feel the heat, right? It's a beautiful proverb. Indigenous cultures in their own way across the globe have understood this. So it's interesting because some of what has survived in time are some of these ceremonies, some of these processes. But I'm curious, are any of you Jewish out there like I am? Okay. I don't know about you, but when it was like my friend's time for bar mitzvah, there was one question that came up. What'd you get? What'd you get? It was not like, how are you transformed? Are you a different being? Do you feel like a man now? Right? And that's just an example of how so many of these processes that still have survived to this day have been co-opted by consumer culture. And they've lost that essential potency that's required to drive transformation and make it happen. There's a couple of other sort of key fundamental lessons in my experience that result as a process of healthy rite of passage or initiation. Knowing your place in the cosmos is one of them. You know, there's a fundamental paradox that's, I think, at the essence of every human life, and that is, and I was reminded of that a couple days ago when I was watching the beautiful blood moon in the eclipse. I don't know if any of you saw that. How small and insignificant we are at one level in the greater scheme of the cosmos, right? We are specks of dust. But the other half of that paradoxical equation is that each of us is immeasurably powerful. Immeasurably. And that there's literally no limit to what we can manifest and how we can impact and change the lives of those around us. So holding that paradox, and in fact experiencing it almost as in a bodily way, is a fundamental part of a healthy rite of passage. So knowing that you're part of the web of life is also a part of that. That you don't exist apart from trees and rocks and waters. We don't exist. Knowing your mission or life purpose, I already spoke to that. Another way of saying that again is gifts or medicine. Beautiful terms. Knowing the depths of your physical and mental capacities. Again, I think that's part of why young people put themselves through trials. Well, let's see if we can drink 3 cases in about 10 minutes. Unconsciously, I think that the part of the drive toward that is seeing what is the limit of this physical body. So, emotions and how to handle them. You know, there's nothing, I just myself did another rite of passage, if you will, a vision quest, and I spent 4 days up in the Eastern Sierra at about 10,000 feet in a mountain desert, fasting. It was about 100 degrees every day, and believe me, all kinds of emotions came up. So it gave me an opportunity again to look at fear, to look at grief, that surfaced as I recollected and thought back on mistakes that I'd made in my lifetime. To look at all of my emotions and to reintegrate them and understand them and not fear them. Again, service to community, that's an essential component, as well as self-empowerment. So imagine, if you will, that we live in a society where all teens have a deep sense of purpose for their life, and they're connected to their deepest passions. Imagine that we live in a world where all teens know their physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional limits, so they don't have to seek them through unconscious trials. And imagine all teens know the rights and responsibilities of adulthood and feel welcome and accepted by elders, by older adults. And imagine that they're actually stakeholders in their community, deeply invested in a community that's thriving. I think that's part of the reason. I live in Oakland, and I think that's part of the reason why we have so many disaffected young people. Nobody's coming up to them saying, I see you. I see the brilliance that you carry. I see some of the gifts that you have. Please offer them, bring them into our community. You are a stakeholder here. And give them the room to start to manifest some of that brilliance. We don't do it. So imagine, too, that all parents know when it's their time to let their young people go forth on their own. This is a problem, like I said before. And yes, I get it. It's partly an economic issue. It's really, really tough now for most people in their 20s to get good jobs, to find decent paying work. And it's especially tough, interestingly enough, for boys, for young men, at an almost 2-to-1 ratio to women. But in addition to that, there's there's no dominant cultural support for parents to say, You have got to turn your young person loose. Otherwise, they won't manifest their own greatness. They won't reach their potential as human beings. I gave a talk about a year ago in North Carolina, and there was a woman who came up to me afterwards. She said, I'm so glad to hear your talk because I kicked my kids out of the house at 18. And I just felt like they really needed it. And, you know, my point is not to condone or condemn. I don't know her, and I don't know her kids or her situation, whether it was the right choice or the wrong choice. But what I do know is there's no cultural support for her. There's no community support for her in making that choice, in affirming that choice, or saying, no, maybe it's too early. Maybe they need another couple of years. So, and lastly, imagine no more suspended adolescents running the country. How sweet would that be? It's interesting because it makes me reflect on John Boehner and his stepping down from Animal House. I actually think that was a very moral and, in fact, noble decision on his part to make. And I saw it as a real sort of culmination, in a way, of his own rite of passage. You know, trying to run herd over this thing called Congress over the last few years, where so many of the members of his own party are giving him the greatest grief. He's like, no, you know, enough. I'm going to step away from this. We can go into that, but I don't have time for it now. So ultimately, you know, young people have to find a way to live their dreams, heal their spirits, and to change the world. We need to give them those opportunities. So this, I won't go into. This is some of what we're doing. This is what, you know, as I said, I'm about art and service, right? I am not the ideal selected guy to head a social movement, and yet that's what I found myself doing because I didn't see anybody else doing it. And I thought, this is essential. We have to do this. So these are some of the things that we've been doing over the last few years to really try to reawaken the adults of this world to their responsibilities to young people. So let me share one last film with you, and then I'll close here. So, you know, this is the voices of the young people speaking for themselves about what it is that they need.
There's so much struggle that our kids are going through.
Kids don't have the attention even from their parents because they're so busy working.
What's our world going to be in the future, our generation? Like, what are we going to do? How are we going to step up to the plate?
We have the opportunity to help other human beings out, and I kind of feel it's our responsibility too.
So I'll need to be more giving, and I'll need to be disciplined to know what should be going on.
Sometimes I feel like I need there to be an adult for me to be able to talk about it, you know, about sex and drugs, and I fear it because I don't know about it.
Don't be afraid to take risks.
It all starts with one person, really. One person can change the world.
If you respect me,
I will hear you.
If you listen to me,
I will feel understood.
If you understand me,
I will feel appreciated.
If you appreciate me,
I will know your support.
if you support me,
As I try new things,
I will become responsible.
when I am responsible, I will grow to be independent.
In my independence,
I will respect you and love you all of my life.
To get us there, all that's needed, really, are community-based, culturally tailored rites of passage and mentorship. And the promise that's before us is that if we do that, then all our young people, in their independence, are going to love us and honor us for the rest of their lives. So thank you. Appreciate it.
You talked about in the film regionally, culturally specific rites of passage. I was involved in a summer mathematics program, and I know maybe other people here have been involved in like the first robotics program, and there was those sorts of experiences for people who were mathematically inclined or technically inclined. But that was a very specific rite of passage. It wouldn't work for lots and lots of people, but it really worked for those people. What about those kind of individually specific rites of passage?
Well, it's absolute. I'm not sure what you're asking. I mean, it's wonderful and it's appropriate, and that was right for you, and that's great. But it sounds like you weren't alone, though. You had a cohort with you. Yeah, all the better. Ideally, it's never an isolated act. We might be isolated for parts of the ordeal, right? But we always have to begin and end in integration with community, And that the more that you can experience an ordeal in conjunction and relationship with others, the deeper that you'll understand your interconnectedness and the deeper those bonds of love will be driven. So, fantastic, great, yeah.
My question is basically around kind of balancing between the importance of the individual and the community. I myself was raised Catholic, and I went through confirmation, and it wasn't a very valuable experience in my mind. But so what I'm wondering is, how do you ensure that these rites of passage in some ways don't become codified to meaninglessness when everyone around you is going through the same rite of passage, such that it doesn't mean anything to you because everyone else is doing the same thing?
Well, again, that gets back to the definition of the efficacy of a rite of passage, right? We need to hear the testimony from the young people themselves. They have to be the ones to say, I'm the proof of the pudding, this worked. And if it didn't, then we need to offer them something else. But that's the function of elders in society too, because they're constantly alert to the responses that the young people are giving. And they can see, well, Joey's not really responding to this. What does he need? What do we need to do with and for him that's going to give him a deeper experience? So that's essential. And it's interesting too, I'll use your question to spring off a little bit. It's both and, meaning if you're Catholic, great. Ideally, we have Catholic confirmation as rites of passage that are potent, that actually do what they're designed to do to grow you into that man you want to become. But we also have to make room for Catholics like yourself who say, I don't want that. For whatever reason, we have to respect that too and offer them something else that will also give them an opportunity to discover their gifts, but maybe outside of that Catholic context.
I know there was a slide that mentioned the 3 phases of the rite of passage. Is there any sort of research more specifically into various things to do? I know, for example, there's like a lot of research with psychedelics on exactly how they help and exactly what doses and how to make this process something you could almost count on for people who are dealing with cancer or dying and stuff like that. But is there a way to use research and science to understand what these tipping points are for people? And when, I know it's a lot of behavioral stuff, which then means lots of people locked away for however much time and then lots of funding to do that. But I think everyone would agree depression's bad, suicide's bad, binge drinking's bad, and all that stuff. But to have the cultural shift to understand that it's something that is logical and actually really important and good to invest in, just like college or everything else, that maybe it's something, again, this shift away from, I think, our approach to drugs and the same thing, an approach to rite of passage is such a long change to engender culturally. And just, I guess, maybe the specifics around research around that or the process. I think on one of the slides you mentioned the YMCA, trying to collaborate with them. But just where does the rubber actually meet the road and how to tip people's perspective into taking action and getting involved?
Well, that last piece is a little bit different, but the substance of your question, I can say, I'm sure there's scientific evidence that sort of is in formative stages around this stuff. But, this work is so new that a lot of the data is just now starting to come in. And it's coming in very sort of rudimentary forms. You know, sort of, there's a group in San Diego called Boys to Men. So they have statistics that verify that attendance goes up, grade average goes up, et cetera, for high school boys who attend their program, et cetera. But by and large, we're still in the very early stages of sort of scientific evidence that you're alluding to. But the whole issue of drugs that you raise is also an interesting one, because certainly many indigenous cultures throughout the planet use psychotropic plants as part of the initiation ceremonies. In fact, ayahuasca, you know, which most of you are probably familiar with, it's come now to North America from South America, was used fundamentally for that purpose for many years. And there's also Martín Prechtel, who wrote many wonderful books about Central American initiation, the native Mayan people. One of the things that he talked about was how one of the first exercises they would do with the elders, they take the boys out in the wilderness and get them drunk as skunks so that they could begin to experience that, but in a safe and contained way. So that's the best answer I can give you, I'm afraid, for now. Do you have a follow-up?
I guess just maybe organizations like the YMCA or actual behavioral research in a university setting, some way where the Western mind or the North American mind, and I know every culture is very different even within, you know, there's microcultures obviously within our country, but to understand in a pragmatic way, regardless of your religion or your family structure or whatever else, that these are things that grade attendance goes up, and maybe it's leapfrogging off that Boys to Men thing, but as opposed to one kind of organization, that it becomes a cultural thing that people are aware of as being extremely helpful, that can meet organizations like schools and or religious you know, organizations of all kinds, and that it's a human experience. The reason I ask about the research is there's something, I think, when you push your physical limits in a fast or in certain endeavors, that nothing else matters, because you are feeling things in a way in the fiber of your body that can't be ignored, regardless of what you thought before or anything else. So,
yeah, well, yeah. I mean, again, you know, there's the scientific evidence is just in the formative stages, but that is part of the task of the organization that I co-founded, called Youth Passageways, is to begin to assemble and collate all of these studies and all of this data. But in addition to that, and I went through the card so quickly, I'll restate it. You know, we at my company, it's a nonprofit called Warrior Films, we have written 6 world-class curricula or toolkits. Parents, high schools, colleges and universities, therapists, counselors, psychologists, youth development centers, and faith-based institutions. So we're basically offering them ideas for curricula, how they can implement some of these practices into their own cultures. So places like YMCAs, for example. So please go online and help yourselves to these things. We're giving them away. And there's a lot of helpful tools in there, especially if any of you are parents. Most of you are probably too young to have teens, but at any rate, if you know people who are parents with struggling teens, and even the high school curriculum, we broke it down by a job. So teachers, there's one set of ideas for administrators and also counselors. So this is, yeah, enough said, yes.
Just to follow up on that question, I mean, you mentioned beautiful things like creating teens more connected to their deepest passion, feeling accepted, reaching potential. And you were saying that you have practical tools for parents so they can actually know how to support their teens. Do you have maybe like a few highlights or tips that you can mention now? Like, what are the things that you suggest to those parents to actually, you know, help their teens to go through that process?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in fact, the parents' curriculum, it starts with them at about at 6th grade, so 12, 13 years old. And for every year, for 6 years, we have a whole set of different ideas for things that you can do. So one example that comes right to my mind, because I faced this with my niece recently. She just turned 16 in January, and we were trying to get her on her own to take a trip out to see us. She lives with my sister right outside New York City. And that's one of the things that is in this program. It's designing trips for young people to experience the world on their own. So, it can start with day trips, just even walking around their community and seeing it perhaps for the first time with new eyes in different ways, and building up to things like that, where you go cross country on your own, the first time ever on a plane by yourself, and get yourself to someplace else. And then to also journal along that way so that they can begin to track their own fears and then their own surmounting of those fears. So I hope that's a good example.
Thank you. Yeah.
I actually came because I just signed up to be a mentor for the first time.
Yay.
So I came more from a personal perspective, and I was wondering if you had any suggestions or advice for how, as a mentor on a limited time frame, I can actually kind of help this transition along, given that I can't create or implement a specific rite of passage.
Well, I'll try to give you a crash course in what I know in mentorship in like a minute or less. First of all, you got to be accountable to that young person. So whatever time you set to meet them, you've got to do it. And if you don't, then you have to renegotiate and be accountable for it. Regularity is key, as you probably already know, ideally once a week or more for a couple hours. I use the 80-20 ratio, listening to them 80% of the time and speaking 20%. So many of us think, okay, I'm a mentor now, I got to share all my life wisdom and I'm going to tell you what to do. No, it's about listening to them and deeply understanding where they're at and going from there. That really, just in that listening, we bless them through our kind and compassionate attention. That is one of the greatest gifts a mentor can bring. So that's some of it. I hope that's helpful. And bless you for doing that. In fact, that's my final question to all of you. How many of you are mentoring and how many of you are being mentored? Because that's how we reform, again, the torn fabric of community. And that's how we create links through time. That's how generational links happen, right? So as I told you, I'm turning 60 in a few weeks. Believe me, I still have mentors who I can turn to give me all kinds of advice when I need it, and also to kick my ass when I need it. And I sure as heck am also mentoring a number of young people, and sometimes not young, my age or even older, but also offering that mentorship. So I really invite you to do that because it's essential. And here's another one for you. If you're not growing as much as that young person, something's wrong. Something is fundamentally wrong because you need to be growing yourself in the process. And if you're not, then you really need to retool it. Thank you all again.
Thank you so much.